The carriage wheels groaned against the cobblestones of the London outskirts, and the damp air of May 1813 clung to the velvet curtains like a heavy shroud. Vivienne Thorne sat perfectly still, but her mind was a whirlwind of calculations and cold fury. She looked down at the heavy leather-bound volume in her lap, which was titled The Handbook of Moral Excellence for Young Ladies. It was a gift from the headmistress, and it was meant to be a guide for her soul, but to Vivienne it was nothing more than a symbol of her chains. She remembered the way the headmistress had looked at her with that mix of pity and disdain, because Vivienne was only the daughter of a penniless artist and a French dancer. The girl sitting across from her was Adeline Somerset, who was the very picture of innocence and wealth. Adeline had eyes like the summer sky, and her heart was as soft as the silk of her expensive gown. She reached out and squeezed Vivienne's hand, and she whispered that she would miss her dearly. Adeline promised that her brother Arthur would find a way to help Vivienne, and she said that their home would always be open to her. Vivienne smiled back, and it was a perfect mask of gratitude, but inside she was screaming. She did not want charity, and she did not want a home that belonged to someone else. She wanted power, and she wanted the world to bow before the girl they had tried to break. As the carriage reached the iron gates of the academy for the very last time, the driver paused to check the harness. Vivienne stood up, and she stepped out into the mud. She felt the cold rain on her face, and she felt the eyes of the younger students watching her from the windows. With a sudden and violent motion, she raised the moral handbook high above her head. She flung it into the deepest, filthiest puddle in the road, and she watched as the white pages turned gray and sodden. The headmistress gasped from the doorway, and she called out that Vivienne was a wicked and ungrateful child. Vivienne turned back to the woman, and her voice was as sharp as a blade. She said that the lady's kindness was like a bead of chalk on a blackboard, and she told her that it was easily erased by class prejudice. She told the woman not to seek gratitude in a soul that she had tried to trample. Vivienne climbed back into the carriage, and she felt a rush of adrenaline that was better than any wine. She told the driver to go, and she did not look back at the gray walls of her prison. They arrived at the Somerset mansion in the heart of London, and it was a place of gold and mahogany. Arthur Somerset was waiting for them in the drawing room, and he was a large man with a red face and a nervous disposition. He had recently returned from his post as a tax collector in the East, and he brought with him crates of spices and silks and gold. He was very rich, and he was also very shy around women, and he spent most of his time eating. Vivienne saw him as her first real target, and she began to weave her web with the skill of a master. During dinner, Arthur spoke at length about the heat of India, and he talked about the fiery curries that the locals ate. Most English ladies would have fainted at the thought of such spices, but Vivienne leaned forward with a look of rapt fascination. She told him that she craved the heat, and she said that her soul was tired of the bland flavors of London. She took a large spoonful of the spicy stew that Arthur had brought, and she felt her throat burn as if she had swallowed coals. Her eyes watered and her heart raced, but she smiled through the pain. She told Arthur that it was the most exquisite thing she had ever tasted, and she watched as his chest swelled with pride. Over the next week, Vivienne became indispensable to the Somerset household. She played the piano for Adeline, and she sang French songs that made the servants stop their work to listen. She sat with Arthur in the library, and she listened to his long and boring stories about colonial administration. She made him feel like a hero, and she made him feel like the smartest man in London. She could see the proposal forming in his mind, and she knew that if she could marry Arthur, she would have the wealth to crush anyone who had ever looked down on her. But there was a shadow over her plans, and that shadow was named Julian Ashford. Julian was a handsome man with a cruel mouth and a title that went back for centuries. He was engaged to Adeline, and he looked at Vivienne as if she were a stray cat that had wandered into a palace. He saw through her smiles, and he recognized the hunger in her eyes. One afternoon he found her alone in the garden, and he told her that he knew what she was doing. He said that a girl like her did not belong in a house like this, and he warned her that he would not let her prey on his future brother-in-law. Vivienne did not flinch, and she did not cry. She looked at Julian, and she saw the arrogance of a man who had never had to fight for anything. She told him that the world was changing, and she said that the era of velvet was built on the backs of people like her. She told him that she would reach the top, and she said that she would look down on him one day. Julian laughed, and it was a cold and mocking sound. He told her that she was nothing but a clever little actress, and he promised that he would see her back in the gutter before the month was over. That night, Julian took Arthur to his club, and he plied him with wine and lies. He told Arthur that Vivienne had been seen with other men, and he whispered that her father had died in a debtor's prison. He made Arthur feel like a fool for believing in her innocence. When Arthur returned home, he was no longer the bumbling suitor. He was cold and he was distant. He avoided Vivienne's gaze, and he made excuses to leave the room whenever she entered. Vivienne knew then that her first battle was lost, but she also knew that the war was just beginning. She received a letter the following morning, and it was an offer for a position as a governess at a place called Blackwater Manor. It was located in a remote part of the country, and it was the home of Sir Silas Vane. It was a place of shadows and old secrets, and it was far away from the glittering lights of London. Vivienne packed her small trunk, and she said goodbye to Adeline. Adeline cried, and she gave Vivienne a gold locket as a parting gift. Vivienne took it, but she did not feel any sadness. She felt only a cold and sharpening resolve. As she boarded the stagecoach for the long journey north, Vivienne looked out at the city she was leaving behind. She thought of Julian Ashford, and she thought of the way he had looked at her with such contempt. She whispered to the wind that she would return, and she promised that she would be more powerful than any of them. She was no longer just Vivienne Thorne, who was the daughter of a dancer. She was a force of nature, and she was moving toward a new destiny. The era of velvet was waiting for her, and she would tear it apart until she found the gold hidden within its folds. The road to Blackwater was long and dusty, and the carriage jolted over every stone. Vivienne sat with her back straight, and she watched the landscape change from green fields to dark forests. She thought about Sir Silas Vane, and she wondered what kind of man he was. She had heard rumors that he was a miser, and people said that his manor was falling into ruin. To anyone else it would have been a death sentence, but to Vivienne it was an opportunity. A man who loved money was a man who could be manipulated. She arrived at the gates of Blackwater Manor just as the sun was setting. The house was a massive pile of gray stone, and it was covered in ivy that looked like grasping fingers. The windows were small and dark, and the air smelled of damp earth and old wood. She stepped inside, and she was met by a cold silence. There were no servants to greet her, and there was no fire in the hearth. She was alone in the dark, but she was not afraid. She took a candle from the table, and she lit it. The flame flickered, and it cast long shadows on the walls. Vivienne smiled, and she said that she was home. She knew that this was where her real education would begin. She would learn to rule this house, and then she would learn to rule the world. The first chapter of her life had been written in mud and rejection. The second chapter would be written in ink and blood. She walked up the stairs, and her footsteps echoed through the empty halls. She was ready for the illusions of the Velvet Era, and she was ready to become the greatest illusion of them all. The game had begun, and Vivienne Thorne was playing to win. She closed the door to her new room, and she listened to the sound of the wind howling through the trees. It sounded like applause, and it sounded like the roar of a crowd. She fell asleep with a smile on her lips, and she dreamed of golden crowns and the look on Julian Ashford's face when he finally realized that he had lost. The next morning the sun struggled to pierce the thick mist that clung to the Blackwater estate. Vivienne woke early, and she dressed in her simplest gray wool gown. She wanted to appear humble, and she wanted to appear hardworking. She found Sir Silas Vane in his study, and he was surrounded by piles of dusty ledgers. He was a thin man with skin like parchment, and his eyes were sharp and suspicious. He looked at Vivienne, and he asked her if she knew how to keep accounts. He told her that his previous steward was a thief, and he said that he did not trust anyone. Vivienne stepped forward, and she picked up one of the ledgers. She pointed out an error in his calculations within seconds, and she showed him where he was losing money on the timber sales. Sir Silas looked at her with a new kind of interest, and he told her that she was clever for a woman. Vivienne thanked him, and she said that she only wished to be of service. By the end of the day, she was no longer just the governess to his neglected daughters. She was his confidential secretary, and she was the one who held the keys to his safe. She had found the weakness in the armor of the Vane family, and she was already beginning to turn the key. She met Alastair Vane a week later, and he was everything his father was not. He arrived on a black horse, and he wore the uniform of a dragoon. He was handsome, and he was reckless, and he carried the scent of tobacco and expensive brandy. He looked at Vivienne, and he did not see a governess. He saw a woman who was dangerous and beautiful. He tried to flirt with her, but Vivienne was cold and distant. She knew that men like Alastair wanted what they could not have. She made him chase her, and she made him dream of her. She was weaving the most dangerous web of all, and it was a web of love and debt and desire. The manor was no longer a dark and lonely place for Vivienne. It was her theater, and she was the lead actress. She watched the family, and she learned their secrets. She knew that the wealthy Aunt Matilda was coming to visit, and she knew that everyone was terrified of being left out of her will. Vivienne began to prepare for the old lady's arrival, and she practiced her music and her flattery. She was going to be the favorite, and she was going to be the one who inherited the Velvet Kingdom. The girl from the gutter was climbing, and she would not stop until she reached the stars. The wind outside continued to blow, and the trees continued to shiver. But inside the walls of Blackwater, Vivienne Thorne was warm. She sat by the small fire she had built, and she looked at the gold locket from Adeline. She wondered if her friend was happy, and she wondered if Julian was still laughing. She closed the locket with a snap, and she put it away. She did not have time for friendship, and she did not have time for the past. The future was calling, and it was made of silk and steel. She was ready to face the HUTC Blackwood, and she was ready to face the king. The illusions were just beginning, and Vivienne was the master of the show. The iron gates of the Vane estate creaked with awe sound that resembled a dying animal, and the gravel path was swallowed by overgrown weeds that clawed at the carriage wheels. Vivienne Thorne looked through the glass, and she saw the skeletal remains of what was once a grand garden. There were no roses here, and there were no manicured lawns, but only the jagged edges of survival. She felt the weight of her small trunk, and she realized that she was now far from the soft carpets of London. Blackwater Manor stood like a tombstone against the gray sky, and its stone walls were stained with the damp tears of many winters. She stepped out of the carriage, and she felt the bite of the northern wind. It was not like the wind in the city, because this air carried the scent of wet pine and ancient secrets. She walked toward the heavy oak door, and she did not wait for a servant to greet her. She knew from the rumors that Sir Silas Vane was too cheap to employ a proper staff, and he preferred the silence of his own greed. She knocked 3 times, and the sound echoed through the hollow interior of the house. When the door finally opened, it revealed a man who looked like he was carved from old bone. Sir Silas Vane was draped in a dressing gown that had seen better days, and his eyes were like 2 cold pebbles buried in a face of wrinkles. He did not offer a welcome, and he did not ask about her journey. He simply stared at Vivienne, and he told her that he expected his daughters to be taught only what was necessary for their station. He said that he had no use for French songs or fancy dancing, and he warned her that every candle she burned would be deducted from her wages. Vivienne bowed her head, and she hid the flash of amusement in her eyes. She told him that she was very economical, and she promised that she would manage his household with the same care she gave to her own soul. The girls were pale and frightened creatures who lived in the nursery, and they looked at Vivienne as if she were a ghost. Their names were Rose and Jane, and they had been neglected by a father who saw them only as expenses. Vivienne did not offer them warm hugs or motherly comfort, but she gave them something better. She gave them a purpose. She taught them to read the ledgers, and she showed them how to count the silver that their father hid away. Within a week, Vivienne had turned the schoolroom into a command center, and she was the one who controlled the flow of information in the house. One evening, while the rain drummed against the windowpane, Vivienne found Sir Silas struggling with a stack of bills from the local timber merchants. The old man was cursing under his breath, and his hands were shaking as he tried to find an error that he knew was there. Vivienne approached him softly, and she offered to help him with the numbers. She sat down beside him, and she felt the chill of the room, but she did not complain. She pointed to a line of text, and she explained that the merchants were overcharging him for the transport of the oak logs. She showed him how to save £50 a year by using a different route through the valley. Sir Silas looked at her with a mix of suspicion and genuine awe. He asked her how a girl like her knew such things, and Vivienne smiled her most innocent smile. She told him that her father was a man of many talents, and she said that she had learned to survive by watching the world very closely. Sir Silas grunted, and he told her that she was more useful than any son he could have imagined. From that moment on, Vivienne was no longer just the governess. She was the ghost who managed the Vane fortune, and she was the only person that the old miser trusted. But the silence of the manor was broken when Alistair Vane returned from his regiment. He arrived late at night, and the sound of his horse hooves rang out like thunder. He was a man of fire and wine, and his presence filled the cold halls with a heat that made the servants tremble. He was the second son, and he was the one who had spent his inheritance before he had even received it. He was a gambler, and he was a soldier, and he was exactly the kind of man that Vivienne knew how to break. They met in the hallway on his first morning back, and Alistair stopped dead in his tracks when he saw her. He had expected a dowdy old woman with a sour face, but he found instead a goddess in grey wool. Vivienne did not drop her gaze, and she did not blush. She looked at him with a cool indifference that was more provocative than any flirtation. Alistair laughed, and he told her that the house had grown much more interesting in his absence. He tried to take her hand, but Vivienne stepped back with a graceful movement. She told him that she was busy with his father's accounts, and she suggested that he find something useful to do with his time. Alistair was not used to being refused, and he found himself thinking about the governess at all hours of the day. He watched her across the dinner table, and he followed her into the library. He saw the way she handled his father, and he realized that she was the true master of Blackwater. He began to leave notes for her, and he offered her gifts of ribbons and lace that he had brought from the city. Vivienne took the gifts, and she read the notes, but she never gave him a word of encouragement. She was waiting for him to become truly desperate, because a desperate man is a man who will promise anything. The tension in the house reached a breaking point when the news came that London HB Matilda was arriving. She was the aunt of Sir Silas, and she was the woman who held the keys to £1,000,000. The entire Vane family was terrified of her because she was a woman of sharp wit and even sharper whims. She could make a man rich with a stroke of her pen, or she could leave him to rot in the streets. Sir Silas ordered the house to be cleaned, and he even allowed Vivienne to buy a few bottles of expensive wine to impress the old lady. When Matilda arrived, she was carried into the house in a sedan chair, and she looked like a queen of the old world. She wore diamonds that were as large as walnuts, and her hair was a mountain of white powder. She looked at Sir Silas with contempt, and she told him that his house smelled of dust and boredom. But then her eyes fell upon Vivienne, who was standing quietly in the corner. Matilda asked who the girl was, and Vivienne stepped forward with a deep curtsy. She spoke to the old lady in perfect French, and she told her that she was there to ensure that her stay was as comfortable as possible. Matilda was delighted to find someone who could speak her language, and she took Vivienne as her personal companion. They spent their afternoons playing the piano, and Vivienne sang songs that reminded the old lady of her youth in Paris. Vivienne listened to Matilda's stories about the royal court, and she laughed at all the right moments. She became the only person who could calm the old lady's temper, and the rest of the family watched with odd jealousy that was almost palpable. Alistair was especially frustrated because he could no longer find Vivienne alone. But Vivienne was playing a much larger game than Alistair could understand. She knew that Sir Silas was dying, and she knew that the fortune of the Vanes was hanging by a thread. She had discovered a secret in the ledgers that showed the estate was deeply in debt, and she knew that only Matilda's money could save them. She also knew that Matilda was planning to leave everything to Alistair's older brother, who was a man of boring virtues and no imagination. Vivienne decided that it was time to change the course of history. One night, while Matilda was sleeping, Vivienne met Alistair in the garden. The moon was a silver sliver in the sky, and the air was thick with the scent of pine. Alistair was drunk, and he was angry. He told Vivienne that he could not live without her, and he begged her to run away with him. He said that they could go to the continent, and he promised that he would win a fortune at the card tables. Vivienne looked at him, and she saw the weakness of his heart. She told him that she would not be a mistress, and she said that she would only belong to a man who was his own master. Alistair fell to his knees, and he grabbed the hem of her dress. He told her that he would do anything she asked, and he said that he would even defy his father for her. Vivienne leaned down, and she whispered into his ear. She told him that they should marry in secret, and she said that they would wait for Matilda to die before they revealed the truth. She told him that with her brain and his name they could rule London. Alistair was blinded by his passion, and he agreed to everything. They were married 3 days later by a poor curate in a nearby village, and the only witnesses were the trees and the wind. The secret marriage was like a hidden fire beneath the floorboards of the manor. Vivienne continued to serve Matilda, and she continued to manage the accounts for Sir Silas. She was the perfect governess by day, and she was the secret wife of the Vane heir by night. She felt a sense of power that was intoxicating, and she knew that she had finally escaped the shadow of her birth. She was no longer Vivienne Thorne, but she was now a member of the aristocracy. But the tragedy struck sooner than anyone expected. The wife of Sir Silas, who had been a shadow in the background for years, passed away during a cold snap in January. The house was plunged into mourning, and Sir Silas became even more eccentric. He began to wander the halls at night, and he talked to the portraits on the walls. One evening he called Vivienne into his study, and he fell to his knees before her. He told her that he was a lonely man, and he asked her to marry him. He promised her that she would be the mistress of Blackwater, and he said that he would give her everything he owned. Vivienne stood there, and she felt the irony of the moment. The man who had once looked at her with such disdain was now begging for her hand. She looked down at him, and she felt a wave of triumph, but she also knew that she could not accept. She told him that it was impossible, and she said that her heart already belonged to another. Sir Silas demanded to know who it was, and his face turned a dark shade of purple. Vivienne did not hesitate, and she told him the truth. She said that she was already the wife of his son Alistair. The silence that followed was more terrifying than any scream. Sir Silas stood up, and he looked at Vivienne as if she were a demon. He told her that he would disown his son, and he promised that they would never see a penny of his money. He ordered her to leave the house immediately, and he said that she was a serpent who had poisoned his family. Vivienne did not cry, and she did not beg. She walked out of the room with her head held high, and she found Alistair waiting for her in the hall. They left Blackwater Manor that night, and they took with them only what they could carry. The carriage ride back to London was long and silent, and Alistair looked like a man who had lost his soul. He was terrified of the future, and he did not know how he would survive without his father's support. But Vivienne sat beside him, and she felt a strange sense of peace. She knew that they were now outcasts, but she also knew that she was free. She had the vain name, and she had the beauty that could open any door. They arrived in London during the height of the season, and the city was a sea of light and noise. They took a small apartment in a fashionable part of town, and Vivienne began to use her remaining gold to buy the clothes she needed. She knew that they had to make a splash, and she knew that they had to find a way into the inner circle of the elite. She told Alistair that his skills at the card table would be their salvation, and she said that she would handle the rest. Adeline Somerset was shocked to hear the news of Vivienne's marriage, and she invited the couple to dinner. Julian Ashford was also there, and he looked at Vivienne with a look of pure hatred. He saw that she had climbed back up from the gutter, and he saw that she was now his equal in rank. He tried to insult her during the meal, but Vivienne turned his words against him with wit that made the other guests laugh. She was the star of the evening, and she made Julian look like a bitter fool. But the reality of their situation was much darker than the glitter of the dinner parties. Alistair was losing more than he was winning, and the creditors were beginning to knock on their door. Vivienne knew that they needed a powerful protector, and she began to look for the one man who could save them. She found him at a ball given by the Duchess of Richmond. He was the AUTC Blackwood, and he was the most feared man in London. He was old and he was wicked, but he had more power than the king himself. Vivienne watched him from across the room, and she saw the way people shrank away from him. He was like a shark in a pool of goldfish, and he looked bored with the world. Vivienne approached him without an introduction, and she asked him if he would like to see a real miracle. Blackwood looked at her with interest, and he asked what she meant. Vivienne told him that she was the miracle, and she said that she was the only woman in London who was not afraid of him. Blackwood laughed, and it was a sound that made the hair on her neck stand up. He told her that she was either very brave or very stupid, and he invited her to sit with him. They talked for hours, and Vivienne felt like she was dancing on the edge of a cliff. She told him about her journey from the academy, and she told him about her secrets at Blackwater. Blackwood listened with a predatory smile, and he told her that he liked her spirit. He promised that he would help her, and he said that he would make her the toast of the town. But Vivienne knew that his help would come with a price, and she knew that he was a man who collected souls. She did not care, because she was willing to pay any price to reach the top. The next morning a package arrived at Vivienne's door. It was a necklace of emeralds that were as green as the sea, and there was a note from the HUTs. It said that the game had just begun, and it invited her to a private dinner at his mansion. Vivienne put on the necklace, and she looked at herself in the mirror. She was beautiful, and she was dangerous, and she was the wife of a man who was drowning in debt. She knew that she was about to step into the fire, but she did not flinch. The era of velvet was full of illusions, and Vivienne was the greatest of them all. She had turned a miser into a suitor, and she had turned a soldier into a husband. Now she was going to turn a devil into a friend. The journey from the mud of the academy to the gold of the HUTCS table was almost complete. She was the rose with the sharpest thorns, and she was ready to draw blood. The summer of 1815 arrived with a heavy heat that seemed to portend the coming storm of history, and the streets of London were filled with the frantic energy of a city on the brink of war. Vivienne Thorne sat before her vanity, and she watched the reflection of a woman who had become the most talked-about figure in the capital. Her skin was as pale as marble, and her eyes were fixed on the distant horizon of her own desires. She had achieved the impossible, and she had climbed from the mud of Blackwater to the gilded drawing rooms of the elite. But the price of her ascent was beginning to show in the hollows of her cheeks and in the coldness of her heart. Alistair Vane was no longer the dashing soldier who had swept her off her feet with a reckless smile. The gambling dens of the city had swallowed his pride, and the heavy burden of debt had turned his laughter into a jagged cough. He spent his nights at the card tables, and he spent his days in a drunken stupor. Vivienne watched him with a mix of pity and disgust, and she realized that her husband was no longer a partner, but a liability. She knew that if she were to survive the coming collapse, she would have to find a stronger branch to cling to. The Marquis Blackwood remained her shadow and her savior, and he moved through her life like a silent predator. He provided the funds that kept the creditors from the door, and he provided the invitations that kept Vivienne at the center of the social whirl. But his gaze had grown heavier, and his demands had grown more transparent. He did not want her gratitude, and he did not want her friendship. He wanted the total submission of a soul that he had bought with emeralds and silk. Vivienne played the game with a desperate skill, and she gave him just enough hope to keep him interested while she kept her true self locked away behind a wall of ice. Adeline Somerset was living a very different life, and her world was crumbling into pieces of broken glass. The Somerset fortune had vanished like mist in the sun, and her father was a broken man who sat alone in a silent house. Julian Ashford had seen the writing on the wall, and he had begun to distance himself from the girl he had once promised to love. He sought a bride with a dowry that could sustain his lifestyle, and he looked at Adeline as if she were a relic of a past he wished to forget. Adeline cried until her eyes were red, and she reached out to Vivienne for comfort. Vivienne saw the opportunity for a revenge that had been simmering in her blood for years. She remembered the way Julian had sabotaged her chance with Arthur, and she remembered the way he had looked at her with such pure contempt. She invited Adeline to her home, and she offered her tea and sympathy. But when Julian arrived to escort Adeline home, Vivienne ensured that she was alone in the garden. She wore a dress of midnight blue, and she wore the emeralds of the Marquise. She spoke to Julian with a voice that was like honey and poison, and she reminded him of everything he had lost by choosing the wrong side. She watched as the arrogance in Julian's eyes turned to a flickering flame of desire. He had always hated her, but he had also always wanted her. Vivienne leaned in, and she told him that Adeline was a weak creature who would only drag him down into the mud. She suggested that a man of his talents deserved a woman who could match his ambition. She did not promise him anything, but she gave him a glimpse of a world where they could rule together. Julian was captivated by the illusion, and he began to visit Vivienne in secret while Adeline sat at home and waited for a letter that would never come. The news of Napoleon's escape from Elba hit London like a thunderclap, and the city was suddenly plunged into the chaos of mobilization. Alistair received his orders to join the Duke of Wellington in Belgium, and he looked at the uniform with a sense of dread. He was no longer the brave dragoon, and his hands shook as he polished his sword. Vivienne watched him prepare for war, and she felt nothing but a cold calculation. She knew that if Alistair died on the battlefield, she would be a widow with a title and a clean slate. She helped him pack his trunk, and she gave him a kiss that was as dry as autumn leaves. The night before the troops were to depart, the Duchess of Richmond held a ball in Brussels that would go down in history as the most famous dance of death. Vivienne was there, and she moved through the room like a shimmering ghost. She saw Julian Ashford, and she saw William Sterling, who was watching Adeline with a look of quiet heartbreak. The music played and the candles flickered, but the air was heavy with the scent of gunpowder and fear. When the call to arms sounded at midnight, the men rushed to their horses, and the women were left to face the silence. Vivienne did not weep when Alistair rode away. She turned her attention to the market, and she saw the panic that was spreading through the city. While others were praying for peace, Vivienne was buying up the supply of horses and grain. She knew that war was our business, and she intended to be the primary shareholder. She used the Marquis Blackwood's influence to secure government contracts, and she watched as her personal fortune began to grow even as the blood began to flow across the fields of Waterloo. The days of the battle were a blur of heat and anxiety. Vivienne sat in her rooms and listened to the distant rumble of the cannons. She knew that her entire future was being decided by the swing of a saber and the flight of a bullet. When the news finally arrived that the French had been defeated, the city erupted in a frenzy of joy. But for Vivienne, the joy was tempered by the arrival of the casualty lists. She searched for the name of her husband, and she found it among the wounded. Alistair was alive, but Julian Ashford had fallen during the final charge of the Guards. Adeline was devastated by the news of Julian's death, and she collapsed into a state of mourning that bordered on madness. Vivienne visited her, but she did not feel any genuine sorrow. She saw only the path that had been cleared for her own advancement. She told Adeline that she must be strong, and she told her that life must go on. But even as she spoke the words, she was planning her next move. She knew that the Marquise was becoming impatient, and she knew that Alistair would soon return as a broken man who would expect her to nurse him back to health. Alistair returned to London with a missing arm and a soul that was haunted by the horrors he had seen. He was no longer the man Vivienne had married, and he spent his days staring at the wall. He became a burden that Vivienne could no longer ignore. She began to spend more time at the Blackwood estate, and she allowed the Marquise to parade her before the king and the court. She became the unofficial queen of the social scene, and she was the one who decided who was in and who was out. She had reached the pinnacle of her ambition, but she was surrounded by enemies who were waiting for her to stumble. The Marquis Blackwood began to exert his control in ways that were increasingly cruel. He forced Vivienne to host parties for his degenerate friends, and he made sure that everyone knew she was beholden to him. He whispered to her that she was nothing without him, and he told her that he could crush her as easily as a dried flower. Vivienne felt the walls closing in, and she realized that she had traded one prison for another. She was no longer the master of the game, but she was now the prize that was being fought over by men who had no hearts. One evening Alastair found a letter from the Marquis hidden in Vivienne's desk. It was a letter that spoke of their private arrangements, and it was filled with the arrogant language of a man who owned his property. Alastair felt a spark of his old pride return, and he confronted Vivienne with the evidence of her betrayal. He screamed at her that she had sold her soul for a few pieces of gold, and he told her that he would kill the Marquis for what he had done. Vivienne looked at him with cold indifference, and she told him that he was a fool who would only get himself killed. Alastair did not listen. He took his sword and he rode to the Blackwood mansion in the dead of night. He found the Marquis in his study and he challenged him to a duel of honor. Blackwood only laughed, and he told Alastair that honor was a concept for men who could afford it. He called his guards and he had Alastair beaten and thrown into the street. He then used his influence to have Alastair arrested for debt, and he made sure that the prison doors were locked tight. Vivienne found herself alone in her grand house, and she realized that she had lost the only person who had ever truly loved her. The scandal was the talk of London for weeks, and Vivienne's reputation was shredded by the very people who had once bowed before her. She was no longer invited to the balls, and she was no longer the toast of the town. She became a pariah who was shunned by the polite society she had worked so hard to enter. The Marquis Blackwood turned his back on her, and he told her that he had no use for a woman who was the subject of such vulgar gossip. Vivienne Thorne was once again the daughter of a penniless artist, and she was once again standing in the mud. But Vivienne was not defeated. She looked at the ruins of her life, and she saw the seeds of a new beginning. She knew that Adeline had inherited a small fortune from a distant relative, and she knew that Arthur Somerset was still unmarried and living in his country house. She packed her bags and she left London behind. She traveled to the seaside resort where Arthur was taking the waters, and she began to play the role of the tragic widow. She told him that Alastair had been a monster who had abused her, and she told him that she was a victim of a cruel world. Arthur was a man of simple passions, and he was easily moved by the sight of a beautiful woman in distress. He believed every word she said, and he offered her his protection and his heart. Vivienne smiled to herself, and she knew that the game was not over. She would marry Arthur, and she would have the wealth and the security she had always craved. She would never have the love of a man like William Sterling, and she would never have the peace of a soul like Adeline. But she would have the velvet, and she would have the gold. As she sat on the terrace of her new home and watched the sun set over the ocean, Vivienne Thorne felt a strange sense of satisfaction. She had survived the era of velvet, and she had survived the illusions that had nearly destroyed her. She was alone, but she was rich. She was hated, but she was powerful. She took a sip of her wine, and she looked at the emeralds that still glittered on her neck. They were the trophies of her war, and they were the reminders of the price she had paid. The girl from the academy had finally won, and the world would never forget the name of Vivienne Thorne. Adeline Somerset eventually married William Sterling, and they lived a life of quiet happiness in the country. They had children who were taught the values of honesty and kindness, and they never spoke the name of Vivienne Thorne. They were the ones who had found the true meaning of the Velvet Era, and they were the ones who had escaped the illusions that had claimed so many others. But sometimes on a cold winter night, Adeline would look at the gold locket that Vivienne had once given her, and she would wonder if her friend had ever truly found what she was looking for. The story of Vivienne Thorne was a story of a rose with thorns that were too sharp for the world to handle. She was a woman of her time, and she was a woman who had dared to dream of more than she was allowed. She had reached for the stars, and she had found only the coldness of space. But she had lived, and she had fought, and she had made her mark on the history of a city that had tried to forget her. The illusions were gone, but the legacy of Vivienne Thorne remained, and it was a legacy of silk and steel and the enduring power of a woman's ambition. The winter of 1816 descended upon London with a cruelty that matched the shifting fortunes of its inhabitants, and the frost clung to the iron railings of the city like a white lace shroud. Vivienne Thorne sat in the center of her drawing room, and she felt the silence of the house pressing against her ears. She was no longer the girl who threw dictionaries into the mud, and she was no longer the governess who manipulated a measure. She was the mistress of a grand house, and she was the wife of a hero of Waterloo. But the hero was rotting in a cell, and the mistress was surrounded by the ghosts of her own making. She looked at the invitations on her desk, and she saw that they were fewer than they had been a month ago. The whispers had begun to turn into a roar of condemnation, and Vivienne knew that the Velvet Era was preparing to spit her out. The Marquis Blackwood had not sent a carriage for her in 3 days, and the absence of his protection was felt like a cold draft through a locked door. Vivienne realized that she had overestimated her hold on the man, and she saw that to him she was merely a beautiful distraction. He was a man who had lived through 7 decades of scandal, and he knew when to cut his losses. He had seen the way the Queen looked at Vivienne at the last court ball, and he knew that the wind was changing. Vivienne stood up and she walked to the mirror. She touched the emeralds around her neck, and she felt the cold bite of the stones. They were the price of her soul, and now they were the only things she had left that were worth anything at all. Alistair was still locked away in the Fleet prison, and the reports from his jailer were increasingly grim. He was drinking away whatever money Vivienne sent him, and he was telling anyone who would listen that his wife was a devil in silk. He had become a liability that she could not afford, but she also could not let him die. If he died in prison, the scandal would be her final undoing. She needed him alive, and she needed him silent. She sat down at her desk, and she began to write a letter to the only man who might still help her. She wrote to William Sterling, and she asked him to visit her. She knew that he despised her, and she knew that he loved Adeline. But she also knew that he was a man of honor, and she hoped to use that honor as a weapon. William Sterling arrived on a Tuesday morning, and his face was a mask of stern disapproval. He did not take the tea she offered, and he did not sit down. He stood by the fireplace, and he looked at Vivienne as if she were a specimen under a glass. He told her that he had come only because Adeline had begged him to see if Vivienne was in actual danger. Vivienne laughed, and it was a brittle sound that echoed through the empty room. She told him that danger was her constant companion, and she said that she was drowning in a sea of debt and lies. She asked him to help her get Alistair out of prison, and she promised that she would leave London forever if he did. William looked at her for a long time, and then he spoke with a voice that was like cold stone. He told her that she had destroyed everything she touched, and he said that Adeline was still recovering from the heartbreak that Vivienne had caused. He told her that Julian Ashford had died with Vivienne's name on his lips, and he said that it was a curse that would follow her to the grave. But he also said that he could not see a fellow officer rot in a debtor's cell. He agreed to pay the debts, but only on the condition that Alistair was sent to the continent immediately. Vivienne agreed to everything, and she felt a rush of relief that was quickly followed by a bitter taste of defeat. The day of Alistair's release was a gray and drizzling morning in November. Vivienne waited in her carriage outside the prison gates, and she watched as her husband stumbled out into the light. He was thin, and his clothes were rags, and his eyes were filled with a madness that she did not recognize. He did not look at her as he climbed into the carriage, and he did not speak a word as they drove toward the docks. Vivienne had arranged for a passage to France, and she had given him a small purse of gold. It was the last of the money she had saved from her horse trading during the war. She told him that he must stay in Paris, and she said that she would send more money when she could. Alistair turned to her then, and he gripped her arm with a strength that made her gasp. He told her that he hated her more than he had ever loved her, and he said that he would find a way to destroy her even from across the sea. He told her that she was a hollow woman, and he said that the Marquis Blackwood would eventually discard her like a piece of orange peel. He climbed onto the ship, and he did not look back. Vivienne stood on the pier, and she watched the sails disappear into the mist. She was now a wife without a husband, and she was a lady without a home. The house in London was being seized by the banks, and her servants had all fled. She returned to the empty mansion, and she began to pack her things. She did not take the heavy furniture, and she did not take the paintings. She took only her jewels and her clothes and the small portrait of her father that she had kept hidden for years. She was interrupted by a knock at the door, and she found the Marquis Blackwood's valet standing on the threshold. He did not enter, and he did not remove his hat. He simply handed her a small box and a letter. The letter was short, and it was written in the Marquis's elegant hand. It said that the lease on the house had expired, and it said that the carriage was no longer at her disposal. The box contained the emerald necklace she had returned to him for cleaning. He was giving it back to her as a parting gift. Vivienne closed the door, and she leaned against the cold wood. She was alone, and she was broke, and she was the most hated woman in England. She looked at the emeralds, and she saw them for what they really were. They were not jewels, but they were the heavy stones that would sink her to the bottom of the ocean. She put them in her bag, and she walked out of the house. She did not have a carriage, so she walked through the muddy streets until she found a small inn near the coach station. She checked in under a false name, and she sat by the window and watched the people passing by. She saw women in fine silks, and she saw men in tall hats. She saw the world she had tried so hard to conquer, and she realized that it had never really belonged to her. The next few months were a blur of cheap lodgings and hidden faces. Vivienne moved from town to town, and she sold her jewels one by one to pay for her food. She heard rumors of the London season, and she heard that Adeline Somerset had finally married William Sterling. The news felt like a dull ache in her chest, but she did not allow herself to cry. Tears were for the weak, and Vivienne Thorne was a survivor. She began to plan her return, but she knew that it could not be to London. She needed a new stage, and she needed a new audience. She thought of the seaside resorts where the wealthy went to escape the heat of the city, and she thought of the men who were old and lonely. She arrived at the coast in the spring of 1817, and she took a room at the best hotel. She used her remaining gold to buy a new dress of lavender silk, and she styled her hair in the latest fashion. She spent her afternoons walking along the promenade, and she spent her evenings in the assembly rooms. She was careful and she was patient. She did not look for young men with handsome faces, but she looked for men with heavy purses and slow minds. She found her target in Arthur Somerset, who was visiting the coast to treat his gout. He was lonely and he was grieving for his father, and he was the perfect prey. Arthur did not recognize her at first because the years of struggle had changed her face, but when she spoke to him, he felt a flicker of memory. Vivienne told him that she was a widow from the north, and she said that she had lost everything in a fire. She told him that she had once known his sister, and she said that she had always admired the Somerset family. Arthur was enchanted, and he began to spend all his time with her. He told her about his life in India, and he told her about his sister's marriage. He did not know that he was talking to the woman who had nearly ruined his family, and Vivienne did not tell him. She was building a new illusion, and this time she would make sure it lasted. One afternoon, while they were sitting on the beach, Arthur asked her to marry him. He told her that he was a lonely man, and he said that he wanted to take care of her. Vivienne looked at the gray sea, and she felt a sense of triumph that was as cold as the water. She said yes, and she let him kiss her hand. She knew that she would never love him, and she knew that she would spend the rest of her life bored by his stories. But she would have a roof over her head, and she would have a name that was respected. She would be Somerset, and she would be the mistress of our grand estate once again. The wedding was a quiet affair, and none of Arthur's family was invited. Vivienne insisted on a private ceremony, and she told him that she wanted to start their new life without the shadows of the past. They moved to Arthur's estate in the country, and Vivienne began to take control of the household. She was efficient and she was firm, and the servants quickly learned to fear her. She managed the accounts, and she oversaw the gardens, and she made sure that Arthur was always comfortable. She was the perfect wife, and Arthur was the happiest man in the county. He did not see the coldness in her eyes, and he did not hear the bitterness in her voice. But the past has a way of finding even the most hidden places. One morning a carriage arrived at the estate, and William Sterling stepped out. He had heard the news of Arthur's marriage, and he had come to see for himself if the rumors were true. He found Vivienne in the garden, and he looked at her with a mix of horror and pity. He told her that he knew who she was, and he said that he would tell Arthur everything. Vivienne did not flinch, and she did not beg. She looked at him with a calm that was more terrifying than any anger. She told him that Arthur would not believe him, and she said that she had already told her husband about her troubled past. She had told Arthur a version of the truth that made her the victim of every circumstance. She had told him that she was forced into her first marriage, and she said that the Marquis Blackwood had been a family friend who tried to help her. She had turned her scandals into tragedies, and she had turned her enemies into villains. William realized that he could not win because Arthur was too deeply under her spell. He looked at Vivienne, and he saw a woman who had become a master of deception. He told her that she would never be happy, and he said that her life was a house of cards that would eventually fall. He left the estate, and he never returned. Vivienne stood in the garden, and she watched his carriage disappear. She knew that he was right, and she knew that she was living a lie. But she also knew that the lie was better than the truth. She went back into the house, and she found Arthur waiting for her. He asked who the visitor was, and Vivienne told him that it was just a traveling salesman who had lost his way. She sat down beside him, and she began to read him the newspaper. She spoke with a voice that was soft and steady, and she did not allow her hand to shake. The years passed, and Vivienne became a pillar of the community. She was known for her charity, and she was known for her elegant parties. She was respected, and she was admired, and she was the envy of all her neighbors. Adeline and William never visited, and Vivienne never spoke of them. She lived her life in a state of quiet desperation, and she found her only comfort in the gold that filled the family vaults. She had won the war, but she had lost the peace. She was the queen of a kingdom of dust, and she was the mistress of a velvet cage. Arthur died 10 years after their marriage, and he left everything to his beloved wife. Vivienne was now a wealthy widow, and she was free to do as she pleased. She did not return to London, and she did not seek out her old friends. She stayed on the estate, and she lived a life of solitary luxury. She spent her days walking through the gardens, and she spent her nights sitting by the fire. She looked at the emerald necklace that she still kept in a velvet box, and she remembered the woman she had once been. She remembered the hunger, and she remembered the passion, and she remembered the fear. She realized then that she had never really wanted the money, and she had never really wanted the title. She had wanted to be seen, and she had wanted to be heard. She had wanted to prove to the world that she was more than just the daughter of a dancer. She had proven it, but at a cost that was too high to calculate. She was Vivienne Somerset, and she was a lady of the realm. But she was also the girl who had thrown the dictionary into the mud, and she knew that the girl was still there screaming in the darkness. She closed the box and she went to bed. The illusions were over and the velvet era was gone. There was only the silence of the night and the cold light of the moon. The year was 1830, and the golden light of autumn settled over the Somerset estate with a heavy and breathless stillness. Vivienne Somerset sat in her grand gallery, and she watched the dust motes dancing in the shafts of sun that pierced the tall windows. She was now a woman of a certain age, and her hair was the color of spun silver, but her eyes remained as sharp and as blue as a winter sea. She was surrounded by the finest treasures that money could buy, and she was the mistress of all she surveyed. She had outlived the scandals of London, and she had outlived the husband who had given her his name. She was the final victor in a war that had lasted a lifetime, but as she looked at the portraits of the dead on her walls, she felt the weight of her crown. The world outside her gates had changed beyond recognition, and the old order of the Velvet Era was fading into the smoke of the industrial age. The news reached her through the newspapers and the letters from her solicitors, and she read about the rise of new men and the fall of the ancient houses. She heard that the Marquis Blackwood had died alone in his cold mansion, and she heard that his heirs were fighting over the scraps of his rotting empire. She felt no joy at his passing, and she felt no sorrow. He was merely a ghost from a play that had ended long ago, and she was the only actress still left on the stage. She sipped her tea, and she felt the silence of the house growing deeper with every passing hour. Adeline Sterling lived many miles away, and her life was a quiet testament to the power of a gentle soul. She had grown old with William by her side, and their home was filled with the laughter of grandchildren who knew nothing of the woman who had once tried to break their family. Adeline never spoke of Vivienne, and she never looked at the old letters that she had kept in a cedar box. She had chosen the path of peace, and she had found a happiness that Vivienne could never comprehend. William Sterling was a gray-haired colonel now, and he still looked at his wife with the same devotion he had felt as a young lieutenant. They were the lucky ones, and they were the ones who had found the truth behind the illusions. One afternoon, a visitor arrived at the gates of the Somerset Manor, and the footman brought a card to Vivienne on a silver tray. The name on the card made her heart skip a beat for the first time in decades. It was the name of a young man who called himself Alistair Vane. Vivienne ordered the servant to show him in immediately, and she stood up to greet the ghost of her past. The young man who entered the room had the same dark hair and the same reckless jaw as the man she had married in a secret village church. He was the son of Alistair, and he had come from France to find the woman who had once been his father's wife. The young Alistair looked at Vivienne with a mix of curiosity and a hidden resentment. He told her that his father had died in poverty in a small town near Paris, and he said that the old soldier had spent his final days talking about a woman who was as beautiful as she was cruel. He told her that his father had left him nothing but a name and a handful of bitter memories. He had come to England to see if the rumors of the wealthy Mrs. Somerset were true, and he had come to see if she had any mercy left in her heart. Vivienne looked at the boy, and she saw the reflection of the only man she had ever truly loved. She saw the waste of a life that she had helped to ruin, and she felt a crack in the ice that had protected her for so long. She did not offer him excuses, and she did not offer him lies. She invited him to stay at the estate, and she began to treat him as the son she had never had. She gave him the finest horses, and she gave him the gold that he had never known. She watched him move through the halls of the house, and she felt a strange sense of redemption. She thought that perhaps she could buy her way out of the darkness, and she thought that she could fix the broken pieces of the Vane legacy. But the young Alistair was his father's son in more ways than one. He had the same hunger for the card table, and he had the same thirst for the wine that had destroyed his sire. Vivienne watched him as he began to repeat the mistakes of the past, and she saw the gold slipping through his fingers like sand. She tried to warn him, and she tried to guide him, but he only laughed and told her that she was an old woman who did not understand the thrill of the game. He told her that she had spent her life hoarding her treasures, and he said that he wanted to live before he turned to dust. Vivienne realized then that some things could not be bought, and she realized that the cycle of ambition and ruin was a force that even she could not control. She felt the futility of her efforts, and she felt the cold return to her bones. The winter of 1831 was the harshest that anyone could remember, and the snow piled high against the doors of the manor. Vivienne fell ill with a fever that would not break, and she spent her days drifting in and out of a world of shadows. She saw the faces of the people she had known, and she heard the voices of the academy girls whispering in the halls. She saw Julian Ashford standing by the window, and she saw Sir Silas Vane counting his gold in the corner. She saw her father painting a portrait of a dancer, and she saw her mother weeping in the rain. They were all there, and they were all waiting for her to join them. Young Alistair came to her bedside one night, and he looked at her with a face that was blurred by the flickering candlelight. He told her that he was leaving for London, and he said that he had found a new friend who would help him make his fortune. Vivienne reached out her hand to stop him, but she was too weak to move. She whispered that the city was a den of wolves, and she told him that the Velvet Era was a trap that would swallow him whole. But the boy did not listen. He took the gold that she had left on the table, and he walked out of the room without looking back. Vivienne was alone, and she was the only soul left in the House of Illusions. As the fever peaked, Vivienne felt sudden and strange clarity. She realized that her entire life had been a performance for an audience that did not care. She had built a kingdom of glass, and she had spent her days polishing the walls while the foundation crumbled beneath her. She had the gold, and she had the title, and she had the respect of the world, but she had never had the simple warmth of a hand to hold in the dark. She had chosen the velvet, and she had lost the heart. She looked at the emerald necklace that lay on the nightstand, and she saw it for what it truly was. It was a heavy chain that she had worn by choice. She called for her solicitor the next morning, and she made her final will and testament. She did not leave her fortune to the young Alistair because she knew that it would only hasten his end. She left the estate to a foundation for the education of young girls who were born without a name. She left her jewels to be sold and the money to be given to the hospitals for wounded soldiers. She left a small locket to Adeline Sterling, and in it she placed a single lock of hair and a note that said only the word forgive. She stripped herself of her wealth, and she stripped herself of her power. She wanted to die as Vivienne Thorne, and she wanted to go back to the mud where she had started. Adeline received the locket a week later, and she sat in her garden as she read the note. She looked at the gray sky, and she felt a tear roll down her cheek. She remembered the girl who had thrown the dictionary into the puddle, and she remembered the woman who had sparkled at the court balls. She realized that Vivienne had been the most miserable creature she had ever known, and she felt a wave of pity that washed away the last of her anger. She whispered a prayer for her friend, and she closed the locket. The war was finally over, and the shadows were at rest. Vivienne Thorne died as the first snow of the new year began to fall. There was no grand funeral, and there were no crowds of mourners. She was buried in a quiet corner of the churchyard, and her headstone bore only her name and the dates of her birth and her death. The wind blew over the grave, and the snow covered the cold earth. The Somerset Manor was turned into a school, and the halls were filled with the voices of girls who were learning to read and to write. They did not know the story of the woman who had lived there, and they did not know the price she had paid for their freedom. The era of velvet was gone, and the world moved on into the bright, noisy future. The illusions were forgotten, and the scandals were buried in the archives of the past. But sometimes when the moon is full and the wind is high, people say that they can see a woman in a dress of midnight blue walking through the ruins of Blackwater Manor. They say that she is looking for something she lost long ago, and they say that her eyes are as blue as the sea. She is the ghost of ambition, and she is the memory of a time when beauty was a weapon and love was a game. Vivienne Thorne had finally found the peace that had eluded her in life. She was no longer a player on the stage, and she was no longer a prisoner of her own desires. She was a part of the earth, and she was a part of the wind. She had traded the velvet for the silence, and she had traded the gold for the stars. The story was finished, and the book was closed. The girl from the gutter had found her way home, and the world was quiet at last.